My name is Taylor. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life I've been known as the steady one. I live in a quiet apartment building, in a city that prides itself on clean sidewalks and polite neighbours. I work in compliance for a mid-sized healthcare firm, one of those jobs where you read the fine print no one else wants to read, where you notice inconsistencies before they become disasters. It's not glamorous, it's quiet, structured, predictable. People tend to underestimate me, not in cruel ways, just subtle ones. They assume I'm soft-spoken because I'm unsure, that I'm calm because I lack fire. That's because I don't interrupt, I don't see. My father used to joke that I was too thoughtful for my own good. My mother called me her peacekeeper. Friends describe me as composed, reasonable, and safe. What they don't realize is that quiet doesn't mean blind. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic confrontations or explosive scenes in parking lots. It's about something much quieter than that, something colder. It's about the morning I found out my father had a second family living in the apartment directly across from ours. And it's about the moment I watched the man who preached loyalty my entire childhood walk into that door and pick up a child who looks exactly like me. I'm not going to tell you that I screamed. I didn't. I'm not going to tell you that I immediately exposed him. I didn't. What I will tell you is that something fundamental shifted in me that day. Not my love, not even my anger, but my understanding. For years, I had accepted the role of the observant daughter, the reliable one, the one who absorbed tension so others didn't have to. I thought loyalty was inherited, that integrity was consistent, that if you listened long enough, the truth eventually revealed itself. I was wrong. This story is about what happens when the quiet person in the room finally stops assuming the best. When she starts documenting instead of dismissing. When silence stops being endurance and becomes a strategy. You'll see how I piece together the smallest details: timing, receipts, glances, elevator stops. You'll see how the man who built his identity on moral speeches didn't realize the person most capable of unraveling him was the daughter he thought would never question him. But more than anything, this is a story about identity, about what we do when the foundation we were raised on cracks beneath our feet, about how you confront betrayal without losing your own moral center. I won't promise drama. I'll promise honesty. And maybe, somewhere in this, you'll recognize that quiet doesn't mean powerless. Have you ever realized the person who taught you your values wasn't living by them at all? If you asked my father who I was, he would have said, without hesitation, my steady girl. He liked that word. Steady. It made him sound like he had raised something solid, dependable, predictable. In our apartment on the 12th floor, directly facing another identical door across the hallway, my role had always been clearly defined. I was the daughter who didn't slam doors, the one who didn't challenge curfews, the one who folded laundry without being asked and remembered to restock the fridge when my mother forgot. When my parents argued, quietly, because our building had thin walls, I was the one who pretended not to hear. I'd put on headphones, sit at the kitchen island with my laptop open, and make a show of being absorbed in work. I learned early that silence preserved dignity. Not reacting kept the peace intact. Relatives described me as mature for my age. Teachers said I had great emotional regulation. Friends leaned on me when their relationships imploded because I never escalated anything. I analysed, I advised, I absorbed. And my father admired that about me. He was a man who believed deeply in image, in structure, in the presentation. He wore pressed shirts even on Sundays. He corrected grammar mid-sentence. He believed loyalty was the highest virtue and spoke about it often. At dinner, during long car rides, whenever the news featured a scandal about betrayal. Integrity is who you are when no one's watching, he would say. I believed him. To him, I was proof that his values had worked. That raising a calm, disciplined daughter reflected well on him. When guests came over, he'd gesture toward me and say, "Taylor's always been the responsible one. Never gives us trouble." I smiled on cue. What he didn't see, what no one saw, was that responsibility can become camouflage. Invisibility doesn't always feel like neglect. Sometimes it feels like praise. Because if you're the easy one, people assume you're fine. If you're composed, they assume you're unbreakable. If you don't demand attention, they assume you don't need it. And I never corrected them. There's a kind of power in being underestimated. I didn't consciously cultivate it at first. It simply grew in the space others left behind. When my younger cousins fought for attention at family gatherings, I stayed quiet and listened to the adults. I learned how they spoke when they thought children weren't paying attention. I learned how narratives shifted depending on the audience. I noticed patterns. My father leaves 10 minutes earlier on Thursdays than he does on other days. His sudden insistence on taking out the trash himself, something he used to delegate to me. The way he kept his phone face down on the table, always. At the time, none of it registered as betrayal. It registered as data. But in our family dynamic, I wasn't the questioner. I was the stabilizer, the emotional shock absorber. When my mother vented about feeling lonely, I listened and reassured her that Dad was just stressed. When my father complained that Mum was too sensitive, I nodded and translated his tone into something softer in my mind. I made everyone more reasonable than they were. That was my quiet talent. And because I never accused, never raised my voice, never demanded explanations, they assumed I didn't suspect, that I wasn't capable of connecting the inconsistencies, that my calm demeanor meant trust without condition. I think that was the first mistake. They saw me as gentle. They didn't realize I was precise. I didn't know yet what those patterns meant. I didn't know that the identical door across from ours would one day hold answers I hadn't thought to look for. At that point, I was still the daughter who believed integrity was inherited. Still the steady one. Still, the girl who thought that if something were wrong, she would feel it immediately. But some truths don't arrive like earthquakes. They arrive like drafts under a closed door, barely noticeable at first. And I was about to feel the first one. The first cut wasn't dramatic. There was no lipstick on a collar. No mysterious late-night phone call that shattered the illusion. If it had been something obvious, I might have reacted sooner. I might have been forced into confrontation before I was ready. Instead, it was something almost embarrassingly small. It started with the elevator. Our building had 2 elevators, but one of them had been under maintenance for weeks. So most evenings, residents rode up and down together, exchanging polite nods and brief weather commentary. I usually came home around 6:10 p.m. My father, supposedly, around 6:30. One Thursday, I stepped into the elevator at 6:05 because I'd left work early for a dentist appointment. As the doors began to close, someone slipped in at the last second. It was my father. He looked surprised. Not guilty, just startled. "Oh," he said, recovering quickly. "You're home early." "So are you," I replied lightly. He smiled. "Meeting got cancelled. Simple, plausible." But when we reached our floor, he didn't step out immediately. He hesitated for half a second, barely perceptible, before following me into the hallway. And that's when I saw it. The door across from ours was slightly ajar, just an inch. Not enough to see inside, but enough to notice movement, a flicker of shadow. My father's eyes shifted toward it for the briefest moment. Then back to me. "Go ahead," he said. "I forgot something in the car." That didn't make sense. He hadn't gone into the apartment yet. "You just got here," I said, not accusing, just stating. He paused, calculated. "Right, I meant, left something in the office. I'll be late. Don't wait for dinner." He pressed the elevator button again. The doors closed. I stood there in the hallway, key in hand, staring at the slightly open door across from ours. It closed softly a second later. That was it. No confession, no proof, just a timing inconsistency and a door that shouldn't have been open. At dinner that night, he arrived at 7:15, carrying takeout containers as an apology. He kissed my mother on the forehead, asked about her day, and complimented the new curtains she'd hung. He was warm, engaged, present. Too present. I watched him the way I'd always watched people when something didn't align. Not with suspicion. Yet. Just out of curiosity. "Meeting run long?" I asked casually. He didn't blink. "Yeah! Budget revisions, boring stuff." I nodded. My mother rolled her eyes affectionately. "He works too hard." And I almost agreed. Almost. Because it would have been easier to dismiss that flicker of hesitation in the elevator. Easier to tell myself I'd imagined the glance toward the other door. Easier to accept the polished version of events. Everyone else did. That's how subtle disrespect begins. Not with cruelty, but with assumption. He assumed I wouldn't notice. Or worse, that I would notice and choose not to interpret. Over the next week, I paid attention to small things I would normally ignore. The rhythm of his keys in the lock, the faint scent of a cologne he didn't usually wear, the way he checked his phone at 5:50 p.m. every Thursday, like clockwork. Nothing definitive, just patterns. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't confront him. I didn't even write it down in my black leather notebook. But I remembered. Because small cuts don't bleed immediately. They wait. And something inside me had shifted. Not into anger, but into awareness. That door across from ours was no longer just a neighbour's entrance. It was a question. And I had just realised I might be the only one willing to ask it. After the elevator, nothing exploded. That's the part people don't talk about enough. When something is wrong, but life continues with perfect surface-level normalcy. Breakfast still happens, bills still get paid, the news still plays at 6. And because nothing collapses, you start questioning your own perception. The following Thursday, I came home at my usual time, 6:10 p.m. The door across the hall was closed. My father wasn't home yet. At 6:32, I heard his keys in the lock. Right on schedule. He walked in, loosened his tie, and asked my mother what was for dinner. He even joked about traffic, shaking his head like a man inconvenienced by the world. I stood at the sink, drying a plate, and listened. It would have been easy to let it go. That's how normalization works. One inconsistency gets folded into routine, then another, then another. Eventually, the discomfort becomes background noise. Over the next month, I noticed more Thursdays. Sometimes he came home exactly when he said he would. Sometimes 10 minutes earlier, sometimes 20 minutes later, with a carefully constructed explanation. What never changed was the rhythm. He would check his watch around 5:50 p.m. I knew because I started timing it from my desk at work. At 6 p.m., he would send a short message to our family group chat. Leaving now. The same wording, the same punctuation. It was precise. Too precise. And twice, only twice, I heard a faint laugh from across the hallway around 6:05. A child's laugh, high, unrestrained. We didn't have children in our immediate wing of the building. I knew that because my mother complained often about wanting grandchildren nearby. The first time I heard it, I told myself a friend must be visiting someone. The second time I paused, not dramatically, just long enough for my breath to catch. At dinner that night, my father launched into one of his usual speeches about loyalty. A co-worker had apparently been fired for hiding financial discrepancies. People don't understand, he said, shaking his head. One lie turns into 10. Character is everything. My mother nodded solemnly. I watched him as he spoke, watched the ease in his posture, the certainty in his voice. There's a particular kind of disrespect that isn't loud. It's subtle. It's assuming that the person across from you cannot reconcile your words with your behavior, that they won't notice when your moral lectures and your private actions diverge. And maybe he believed that about me. Maybe he believed I needed him too much to question him. I began rationalizing on his behalf. Maybe he was helping a neighbor. Maybe he had taken on a mentorship role. Maybe the child's laugh was a coincidence. Maybe the elevator moment had been exactly what he said, a cancelled meeting and my overactive mind. It's remarkable how far we'll stretch logic to preserve stability. I didn't confront him, because confrontation would have forced clarity, and clarity would have demanded action. Instead, I stayed quiet. But my silence had changed. Before it had been automatic, an instinct to maintain peace. Now it was intentional. I began carrying my black notebook again, something I'd stopped doing after college. I didn't write accusations. I wrote timestamps. Thursday, 6:04 p.m., elevator sound. Thursday, 6:06 p.m., soft thud across hall. Thursday says 6:28 p.m., message, leaving now. It wasn't obsessive. It was the measured. Because once you notice the first small cut, you start tracking where the blade moves next. No one else noticed the shift in me. I still laughed at my father's jokes, still reassured my mother when she worried he was overworked, still played the steady daughter. But internally, something had hardened. Not into bitterness, but into discipline. If there was nothing there, I would eventually prove that to myself. If there was something there, I would know. And either way, I would not be the last person in the room to understand my own life. The normalization phase is the most dangerous part of betrayal. Because if you accept it long enough, it becomes the new standard. And I had just decided, quietly, that I would not accept confusion as normal. Not anymore. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize that this wasn't just about suspicion. It was about the role I had been trained to play. In our family ecosystem, my mother was the emotional center. She felt everything first and most intensely. If something shifted in tone, she sensed it immediately, but she also doubted herself just as quickly. She needed reassurance the way other people need sleep. My father was the architect, the decision-maker, the narrator of our family story. He defined what counted as serious and what was dismissed as overthinking. And me, I was the regulator. When my mother spiraled, I steadied her. When my father grew impatient, I softened him. I translated their frustrations into something palatable for each other. I edited their emotions so the household could continue functioning. Reliable, useful, invisible. It wasn't malicious. No one sat me down and assigned the job, but roles like that are absorbed, not announced. And the more competent you are at holding tension, the more people rely on you to do it. I started noticing how often my father leaned on that dynamic. If my mother questioned him about late nights, about his distracted tone, he would turn to me. "Taylor, you understand how work is," he'd say. "Tell your mom I'm not doing anything unusual." It sounded harmless, a simple appeal to logic, but it was positioning. He wasn't asking me for an opinion. He was assigning me to validate his narrative. And I always had. Until recently, the Thursday routine continued, steady as clockwork. I didn't change my behavior outwardly, but internally, I stopped translating for him. I stopped smoothing over inconsistencies before they formed into conflict. One evening, my mother sighed at the dinner table. "He seems distant lately," she said quietly, not looking at either of us. My father chuckled lightly. "Distant, I'm sitting right here." She smiled, embarrassed. "You know what I mean." He looked at me. It was subtle, that glance. The same glance from the elevator hallway. A silent cue. Explained to me. For the first time, I didn't. "I think we all get tired sometimes," I said evenly. Not defending, not accusing. Neutral. The air shifted almost imperceptibly. My father studied me for half a second longer than usual. Then he nodded and changed the subject. That was when I understood something important. My silence was part of the structure. As long as I absorbed the doubt, the system held. If I stopped absorbing it, the cracks would show. Across the hallway, life continued behind that closed door. Groceries appeared outside it occasionally, small bags with cartoon characters printed on them. Once, I noticed a tiny pair of sneakers lined up neatly against the wall. They were pink and white. Too small for coincidence. I didn't stare, I didn't linger, but I catalogued. The more I observed, the more I understood that my assigned role required blindness. Not literal blindness, but selective attention. The ability to notice without interpreting. And I had been very good at that, because acknowledging what might be happening across from us would disrupt more than a marriage. It would disrupt my identity as the steady daughter, the rational one, the glue. What happens to the glue when it stops holding? I began to see that my father's confidence wasn't just built on secrecy, it was built on predictability. He believed he knew exactly how each of us would respond. My mother would doubt herself. I would steady the room. He would control the narrative. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me careful. Because if I had been assigned the role of invisible stabilizer, then stepping out of it couldn't be impulsive. It had to be intentional. I wasn't ready to confront him, but I was no longer willing to be cast as supporting evidence in a story I hadn't agreed to. And for the first time in my life, I began imagining what it would mean to stop playing the part they had written for me. Not loudly, not dramatically, just permanently. The shift didn't happen on a Thursday. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. Sundays were sacred in our apartment. My father made coffee in the French press. My mother watered her plants. I usually reviewed work notes at the dining table, pretending I wasn't listening to their easy, familiar rhythm. That day was quiet, unremarkable, until the knock. It wasn't loud, just 2 polite taps on our door. My mother looked up, surprised. "Are we expecting anyone?" My father's reaction was almost invisible, but I saw it. His spine straightened. His hand paused mid-air, hovering above his coffee mug. "I'll get it," he said quickly. Too quickly. I don't know what instinct made me stand up as well. Maybe curiosity, maybe something deeper. I didn't speak. I just moved into the hallway a few steps behind him. When he opened the door, the world rearranged itself. Across the threshold stood a woman in her early 30s. Calm, composed, holding the hand of a little girl. The girl couldn't have been older than 4. She had my father's eyes. And my face. Not identical, but unmistakably connected. The same arch of the eyebrows, the same dimple on the left cheek, the same slightly tilted head when observing something unfamiliar. She looked up at him and smiled with complete recognition. "Daddy," she said softly. The word landed without echo, without drama. Just a fact. Time didn't slow down. It sharpened. The woman's eyes flicked past my father and landed on me. There was no malice in them. No fear. Just awareness. like she understood that I had always been closer to the truth than anyone realized. My mother stepped into the hallway behind me. "Who is it?" she asked. And for the first time in my life, my father didn't have a speech ready. He didn't lecture about loyalty. He didn't redirect the narrative. He didn't assign me to translate. He just stood there. The little girl tugged gently on his hand. He bent down automatically, instinctively, and picked her up. And I watched the man who had spent my entire childhood preaching integrity lift a child who looked exactly like me, right there in the doorway of the apartment he shared with my mother. No shouting followed, no dramatic collapse. The woman spoke first. Her voice was level. "I think it's time," she said quietly. Not to me, to him. That was when I understood something essential. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a neighbor misunderstanding. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a second life, deliberate, structured, maintained. And it had been living 10 feet away from mine. My mother's hand found the wall for support. I could hear her breathing change, small and uneven. My father finally turned toward us, the child still in his arms. "Let me explain," he began. But I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. Every Thursday timestamp, every elevator hesitation, every glance toward that door, they rearranged themselves into a coherent pattern. This was never about suspicion. It was about proximity. He hadn't hidden a second family across the city. He had hidden them across the hallway. Close enough to manage, close enough to control, close enough to believe no one would ever question the logistics. And in that moment, something inside me settled, not into anger, to resolve, because I understood, with complete certainty, that whatever happened next could not be reactive. It could not be louder. It could not be chaotic. He had built this structure carefully. If it was going to collapse, it would not be by accident. It would be by design. And for the first time, I wasn't the steady daughter. I was the witness. The strangest part about discovering your father has a second family living 10 feet away is how quickly life demands normalcy. Doors close, conversations pause, and then everyone waits to see who will shatter first. My mother didn't scream. She walked past my father, past the woman, past the little girl who was still resting comfortably in his arms, and went straight into the bedroom. She shut the door quietly. That quiet was heavier than any outburst. The woman across the hall didn't apologize. She didn't argue. She just looked at my father and said, "You can't keep dividing time anymore." Dividing time. Not love, not loyalty. Time. He set the child down gently. She reached for his hand again, instinctively trusting. He hesitated this time, just for a fraction of a second, before letting go. "Go inside," he told them softly. The door across from ours closed, and just like that, the hallway returned to stillness. He turned to me next. "Taylor," he began, voice tight but controlled, "I was going to tell you." That was almost impressive. The instinct to position himself as strategic even now. I met his eyes, calmly. "When?" I asked. It wasn't accusatory. It was procedural. He didn't answer. Instead, he ran a hand down his face and exhaled sharply, as if he were the one absorbing shock. "You don't understand, he said. I could have responded emotionally. I could have asked how long. I could have asked why her face looked like mine. But something in me had crystallized. If I reacted like a daughter, he would manage me like one. So I didn't. "I understand enough," I said evenly. "The rest is details. Silence, when used intentionally, is destabilizing." He tried to fill it. "It's complicated. It started years ago. Didn't plan a—" "Stop," I said quietly. Not loudly, not angrily, just enough to interrupt the script. He stared at me, as if seeing me for the first time. Not as the steady child, but as an adult who no longer required translation. "Mom deserves the truth," I continued. "And so do I, but no explanations, facts." He blinked. He wasn't used to being spoken to without emotional cushioning. In the days that followed, the apartment felt like neutral territory in a quiet war. My mother barely left the bedroom at first. When she did, her face was composed in a way that scared me more than tears would have. My father moved carefully, measured. He offered to sleep on the couch. He made dinner twice. He attempted a normal conversation. Across the hallway, life continued. I heard the little girl laugh again. It no longer sounded distant. It sounded personal. Here's what changed in me. I stopped reacting in real time. I didn't argue. I didn't comfort. I didn't accuse. I observed. I listened to the fragments of conversation through thin walls. I noted when my father left our apartment and how long he stayed across the hall. I noticed which nights he returned before midnight and which nights he didn't. Silence was no longer endurance. It was positioning. He mistook it for restraint, for maturity, for forgiveness in progress. That was his second mistake, because when you stop speaking impulsively, you start seeing strategically. And what I saw was this. He believed the discovery itself was the worst part. He thought the damage had already peaked. He didn't realize that discovery is only information. What you do with it is power. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to preserve the structure. I was evaluating it, not emotionally, architecturally. People assume preparation is dramatic. It isn't. Preparation is quiet, administrative, almost boring to watch, which is why no one notices it. The week after the hallway revelation, my father requested a family discussion. He used that phrase like a board meeting, controlled, agenda-driven, emotionally contained. We sat at the dining table. My mother is across from him, me at the end. He explained timelines, 4 years. That's how long the second life had existed. He used words like complicated, unintended, and responsibility. He emphasized that he had always provided for us. Provided, as if logistics neutralized betrayal. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge inconsistencies. I let him talk. The more someone speaks uninterrupted, the more they reveal. After that conversation, I did something simple. I scheduled a consultation, not with a therapist, not yet, with a financial attorney. It wasn't theatrical. I didn't march into an office demanding retribution. I booked a discreet virtual meeting under the pretense of reviewing estate planning questions. Because here's what most people don't understand about quiet personalities. We do our research before we react. I learned about property ownership laws, about joint accounts, about beneficiary designations, about how hidden dependents affect tax filings, about trust structures. I didn't assume fraud. I verified exposure. At work, compliance had trained me to look for risk before a crisis. So I applied the same framework at home. What assets were shared? What liabilities were concealed? What legal vulnerabilities existed if this became public? Meanwhile, my father operated under a different assumption, that emotional processing was the primary battlefield. He tried gentleness with my mother. He tried reason with me. Families survive worse, he said one evening, leaning against the kitchen counter. Some do, I replied. He watched me carefully. You're taking this surprisingly well. That word again. Steady. He thought my composure meant acceptance. He didn't notice the spreadsheets I built late at night. The copies of mortgage documents I requested under the guise of helping my mother organize paperwork. The subtle review of our building's lease agreements. And across the hall, I began observing differently. The woman, her name, I learned from a package label, was Elena, wasn't reckless. She was structured. Groceries are delivered at consistent times. The school pickup schedule is visible through the hallway rhythm. She wasn't hiding. She was living. That told me something critical. This wasn't chaos. It was maintenance, which meant money had to be flowing in 2 directions. And money leaves trails. I didn't hate my father. That's the part people expect. What I felt instead was recalibration. He had made decisions assuming we would respond emotionally, that we would either explode or forgive, that the damage would remain internal. He never calculated for documentation. One afternoon, while helping my mother gather paperwork, I noticed something subtle. A separate savings account listed under his name only. It wasn't enormous, but it was active. Regular transfers, consistent amounts. Thursdays. The same day he checked his watch at 5:50. I didn't accuse him, not yet. I photographed the statements. Not out of spite, out of clarity. Because once you understand leverage, you don't announce it. You secure it. At dinner, he asked if we could find a path forward. I nodded slowly. There will be one, I said. And I meant it. Just not the one he was imagining. What they never noticed about me was that I don't act when I'm hurt. I act when I'm certain, and certainty was getting closer every day. The private reveal didn't come from my father. It came from paperwork. There's something about financial records that strips emotion out of betrayal. They don't argue, they don't justify. They simply record behavior in numbers and dates. 4 years. That's how long the transfers had been happening. Monthly at first, then bi-weekly, then weekly. Consistent, structured, intentional. The account wasn't hidden well. It was simply unexamined. My mother had trusted him to handle the investments. I had trusted that the structure of our home matched the speeches delivered inside it. I stopped trusting speeches. Instead of confronting him immediately, I scheduled another consultation, this time in person. I brought printed copies, highlighted dates, notes in the margins. The attorney didn't react emotionally either. She spoke in measured language. "Is your mother aware?" she asked. "Not fully," I said. "So yeah, Isomid." "And what is your goal?" That question stayed with me. Not revenge, not humiliation, protection. "If this escalates," she continued, "documentation matters. Quiet documentation." I almost smiled. Quiet documentation was my specialty. That evening, I stood in the hallway alone. The door across from ours opened just as I was locking ours behind me. Eleanor stepped out, holding a small backpack in one hand. The little girl stood beside her, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. She looked at me without fear. "Hi," she said. Her voice was bright, curious. I crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "Hi." Eleanor watched carefully, not defensive, but aware. She understood that I knew. There was no performance between us. "I think we should talk," she said quietly. "Not as rivals, as adults." We met the next day at a cafe 2 blocks away. Neutral ground, no raised voices, no accusations. She didn't pretend innocence. She didn't paint herself as a victim. "He told me he would handle it," she said. That he needed time." "How much time?" I asked. Her expression shifted slightly. "Enough to protect everyone. Protect everyone." The irony almost felt clinical. She slid something across the table, copies of a lease agreement. His name was on it. Co-signed. 4 years ago. So this wasn't temporary. It was infrastructure. "I didn't know you lived across from him until after we moved in," she said. "He said it was easier, that it kept things balanced." Balanced, like time slots on a calendar. I didn't feel anger toward her. That surprised me at first. But anger requires deception. She wasn't deceiving me now. My father had constructed 2 narratives and positioned himself at the center of both. The private reveal wasn't that he had another family. It was that he believed he could manage parallel realities indefinitely. And that belief was fragile. When I walked back into our apartment that evening, my father was seated at the dining table, reviewing something on his laptop. "Where were you?" he asked casually. "Out," I said. He nodded. He still believed he was ahead of the situation. He didn't know I had timelines from both sides now. Lease agreements, bank transfers, dates that overlapped with family vacations and loyalty speeches. Leverage isn't loud. It's alignment. And for the first time, all the pieces were aligned in my hands. I didn't celebrate. I didn't confront. I sat across from him and studied his face while he worked, memorizing the confidence of a man who didn't realize the architecture of his double life had already been mapped. The private reveal isn't about exposure. It's about clarity. And I was finally clear. Once you have clarity, you face a choice. And choices are heavier than discoveries. For several nights, I lay awake mapping outcomes in my head. Not emotionally, logistically. Every option branched into consequences. Option 1. Expose everything publicly. Tell extended family. Inform his colleagues. Collapse both households in one decisive move. It would have been dramatic, immediate, satisfying in a way, but it would also hurt my mother the most. Option 2. Demand that he leave our apartment and formalize his second life openly. Force a clean break. That would restore honesty, but at a cost my mother hadn't prepared for, financially or emotionally. Option 3. Do nothing. Let them negotiate their own quiet arrangement while I step away entirely. That would protect my peace, perhaps, but it would leave my mother structurally vulnerable if things turned hostile. And then there was option 4. The irreversible one. Not loud, not explosive, structural. I scheduled one more meeting with the attorney, this time with my mother. I didn't overwhelm her with accusations. I presented documents calmly, transfers, lease agreements, co-signatures, dates. She didn't cry this time. She read. That was the moment I knew she had shifted too. "I trusted him," she said softly. "I know," I replied. The attorney explained her rights in measured tones. Joint assets, alimony structures, custody implications, though there were no minors in our household. Exposure risks if financial disclosures revealed inconsistencies. My mother listened without interruption. When the meeting ended, she looked at me in a way she never had before, not as her steady daughter, but as her equal. "What do you think we should do?" she asked. That question mattered. Because I wasn't deciding for her. I think, I said carefully, we protect you first. Everything else can follow. The irreversible choice wasn't to destroy him. It was to restructure everything quietly, before he realized the foundation was shifting. We began with small steps. Separate accounts, updated beneficiaries, copies of shared documents are stored securely outside the apartment. No confrontation, no announcement. Across the hallway, life continued as usual. I could hear the little girl practicing the alphabet one evening. My father's voice floated faintly through the wall, patient and warm. The contrast was almost surreal. Two versions of him, both real, both deliberate. He still believed the situation was emotional. If he managed tone and timing, he could negotiate stability. He didn't see the paperwork moving. One night, he approached me cautiously. "Your mum's been distant," he said. "She's processing." I replied. He studied me. "And you?" I held his gaze. "I'm deciding." That unsettled him. Because of his indecision, he could not influence. He could not make a decision. The irreversible choice wasn't about confrontation. It was about preparation without permission. By the time he would understand what was happening, the options available to him would be narrower than he imagined. Not because I wanted him cornered, but because I wanted my mother to be protected. And protection requires timing. I had chosen my path, quietly, completely, and there was no turning back. Once a decision is made, movement becomes methodical. There's no rush, no visible urgency, just execution. My mother opened a new bank account in her name only, not dramatically, just a quiet appointment on a Tuesday afternoon. I went with her, not as a daughter clinging to outrage, but as a second set of eyes. We redirected her income there, small at first, then entirely. Beneficiaries on retirement accounts were reviewed, adjusted, updated. Insurance policies were examined line by line. I asked neutral questions, the kind I ask at work when auditing compliance gaps. What's the current designated contact? When was this last reviewed? Who has signing authority? No accusations, just process. My father noticed none of it. Why would he? On the surface, nothing had changed. Dinner still appeared at 6. The television still murmured in the evenings. My mother still spoke to him politely, though without softness. Across the hallway, his second life maintained its rhythm. Thursdays at 6:05, Sundays at 3 p.m, one overnight every other week. I didn't track it obsessively anymore. I didn't need to. The structure was predictable. The attorney filed preliminary paperwork, not divorce papers yet, but financial protection documents. Asset disclosures were requested formally, but quietly. It was framed as routine estate review. He signed them without hesitation. That was the moment I understood the depth of his confidence. He believed he was still orchestrating outcomes. One evening, he stood in the kitchen while I rinsed dishes. "I've been thinking," he began. "Maybe we should all sit down. You, your mum, Eleanor. Figure out something stable." Stable. The word almost felt rehearsed. I turned off the water and dried my hands slowly before answering. "Stability requires transparency," I said. "I know," he replied quickly. "That's what I'm trying to do. Trying to build." Build? As if the foundation hadn't already cracked. "What exactly are you building?" He paused. That pause told me everything. He didn't have a clear answer. He had an intention, yes. Control, maybe, but not a sustainable plan. Because sustainable plans require honesty from the start. Ours required recalculation. The building management received a formal inquiry from my mother 2 weeks later. "Hypothetical," she said. "About lease restructuring in the event of separation." The manager's tone shifted immediately. Professional, discreet. News travels quietly in buildings like ours. My father still didn't know. He continued moving between doors with the confidence of someone who believes proximity equals invisibility. But proximity also magnifies exposure. The most strategic move we made was the simplest. Documentation stored externally, copies in a safety deposit box, digital backups under secure passwords he had never known. It wasn't about catching him off guard. It was about ensuring that when the inevitable confrontation came, we would not be negotiating from confusion. Silence is often mistaken for passivity, but silence with paperwork behind it is leverage. One Thursday evening, I stood in the hallway again as he stepped out of our apartment. He hesitated when he saw me. "You going somewhere?" he asked. "Yes," I said calmly. "Where?" "Forward." He frowned slightly, unsure if I was joking. I wasn't, because moving in silence doesn't look like movement. until it's too late to reverse. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They seep in. The first sign wasn't a confrontation, it was confusion. My father sat at the dining table one evening, flipping through a stack of mail. His brow furrowed slightly. "Did the bank send something about account restructuring?" he asked casually. My mother didn't look up from her tea. "Yes, I updated a few things." He nodded slowly. "Without mentioning it?" "It didn't seem urgent," she replied. There was no accusation in her tone, just neutrality. He studied her for a moment longer than usual. Something had shifted in his internal calculation. He could feel movement, but he couldn't see the source. See, that's what consequences feel like at first. Disorientation. A week later, he mentioned that one of his credit cards had requested additional documentation. Routine verification, they said. Compliance audits have a way of surfacing patterns when patterns overlap. He grew mildly irritated. Banks are overreacting to everything these days, he muttered. I didn't respond. Across the hallway, Eleanor's door remained closed more often. I noticed grocery deliveries had shifted to earlier hours. My father's Thursday rhythm became less predictable. For the first time, he wasn't managing time smoothly. He was reacting. One Sunday afternoon, I overheard raised voices through the thin wall between the two apartments. Not shouting, strained urgency. "You said this wouldn't get complicated," Elena's voice carried faintly. "It's under control!" he insisted. Under control. The phrase had been his anchor for years. But control requires stable variables, and variables were shifting. My mother received formal confirmation of updated asset structures. Separate accounts are now fully active, automatic transfers rerouted, beneficiaries reassigned where legally permissible. Nothing illegal, nothing vindictive, just protected. The next visible crack came when my father requested a family dinner, both households present. "It's time to stop pretending," he said. Interesting choice of words. We agreed. The dinner wasn't explosive. It was quiet, structured, almost corporate. Eleanor sat across from my mother. The little girl, Lila, I had learned, coloured in a notebook beside her plate. She looked up at me once and smiled shyly. I smiled back. My father cleared his throat. "I think we need to find a solution that keeps everyone secure." Secure. My mother folded her napkin deliberately before speaking. "Security begins with disclosure," she said evenly. "Full disclosure." His jaw tightened slightly. "I've disclosed—" "No," she interrupted softly. "You've managed." That landed. Because management implies strategy. Disclosure implies surrender of narrative. For the first time, he realized something essential. The room was no longer dependent on his framing. He looked at me, searching for alignment. I held his gaze calmly. "We've already begun protecting our interests," I said. "Legally." The word hung in the air. Legally. Not emotionally, not personally. Structurally. Eleanor's expression shifted. Surprise, then calculation. She hadn't known the groundwork had been laid either. Consequences don't roar, they tighten. Over the next few weeks, his financial flexibility narrowed. Questions required documentation. Accounts required transparency. Timelines had to be clarified under formal review. Nothing public, nothing humiliating, just systems responding to information. He had built 2 lives, assuming silence would preserve them. He hadn't considered that silence could also reorganize them. And as the pressure increased, he began to understand something I had realized months ago. The most powerful shift isn't when someone yells. It's when they stop absorbing the impact entirely. Panic doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks like negotiation. My father began using a softer voice. Not the authoritative tone from the dinner speeches. Not the confident cadence from the family meetings. This was different. Measured, careful. "I think we moved too quickly," he said one evening, standing in the kitchen doorway while my mother folded laundry. "We could slow this down." Slow this down. As if momentum had been accidental. My mother didn't stop folding. 4 years wasn't slow. He flinched almost imperceptibly. He turned to me next. "You're influencing her," he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization. I met his eyes. "I'm informing her." That distinction mattered, because influence implies manipulation. Information implies choice. Over the next week, his routines fractured. He spent less time across the hallway, then suddenly more. Then overnight stays stretched unpredictably. He was recalculating, trying to restore balance between 2 structures that no longer responded to him. One night, I heard him pacing in the living room long after midnight. the soft rhythm of his footsteps moving from window to kitchen to hallway and back again. I remembered being a child and hearing those same steps when he was stressed about work. Back then, I used to get up and ask if he needed tea. This time I stayed in my room. Across the hall, the tension had shifted too. Eleanor knocked on our door one afternoon while my father was at work. "I didn't know," she said directly, "about the accounts, about the legal filings." My mother nodded once. "You weren't supposed to." Elena's composure wavered slightly, not in anger, uncertainty. He said he had it handled. That phrase again, handled. I watched them both carefully. Two women who had trusted the same narrative. The difference now was preparation. "We're not trying to hurt you," my mother said calmly. "We're protecting ourselves." Eleanor absorbed that. The reality was becoming undeniable. The dual life equilibrium had depended entirely on our passivity. Without it, the structure was unstable. My father tried one final strategy: emotion. He sat me down alone one evening, his expression tired in a way I hadn't seen before. "I made mistakes," he said. "But this doesn't have to destroy everything." I studied him, not as a daughter seeking reassurance, but as an adult evaluating a proposal. "What does everything mean to you?" I asked. He hesitated. "Our family." I nodded slowly. "Which one?" The question wasn't cruel. It was clarifying. His silence answered it. By then, legal notices were no longer preliminary. Formal separation discussions had begun. Asset disclosures required signatures. Financial transparency could no longer be postponed. He had assumed time would always be elastic, that he could stretch it between doors indefinitely. But time, once examined, contracts. The final shift happened quietly. My mother signed the formal paperwork initiating separation. Not angrily, not tearfully, just deliberately. When she placed the pen down, she exhaled. Not in despair, but in completion. It was too late to negotiate sentiment. Too late to reframe narrative. Too late to slow this down. Because slowing down only works before documentation begins. And documentation had begun months ago. He stood in the hallway that evening, looking at both doors. For the first time, he didn't move toward either. He just stood there, between two lives, realizing neither was fully his anymore. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in the hallway. Neutral territory. By then, paperwork was in motion. The separation agreement had been drafted. Asset disclosures reviewed. Living arrangements under negotiation. The mechanics were no longer hypothetical. My father asked to speak with me alone. We stood between the two doors, the one I had grown up behind and the one that had quietly mirrored it for 4 years. He looked tired, not defeated, just stripped of narrative. "I underestimated you," he said finally. There was no sarcasm in it. "I know," I replied. He nodded once, accepting the simplicity of that truth. "I thought you'd react emotionally," he continued, "or distance yourself. I didn't expect strategy." That word again. Strategy. "You raised me," I said calmly. "You taught me to value structure, accountability, integrity." A faint, almost ironic smile touched his face. "I suppose I did." Silence settled between us, not hostile. Just honest. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "I believe that," I answered. "And I did. Intent and impact are not the same." "You could have destroyed me," he added quietly. "At work, publicly, with the family." I met his gaze steadily. That wasn't the goal. What was? Protection. He absorbed that. For years, he had equated control with protection, managing time, managing information, managing emotions. I had redefined it. Protection wasn't concealment. It was preparation. Across the hallway, the door opened briefly. Lila stepped out, holding a small stuffed animal. She paused when she saw us, uncertain. He looked at her, then back at me. Guilt flickered across his face, not because of exposure, but because proximity made everything visible. "She deserves stability," I said softly. He nodded. "I know. And so does Mum." Another nod. The truth had simplified things. There were no dramatic accusations left to make, no revelations waiting in shadows. Everything was documented, everything acknowledged. "I don't hate you," I said after a moment. That surprised him. "I don't either," he replied. Quick. Almost defensively. "I know." What I felt wasn't hatred. It was recalibration. You built 2 lives thinking you could manage both. I continued evenly. You didn't account for what would happen when the people inside them stopped depending on you to define reality. He didn't argue, because he couldn't. The legal process would continue. Living arrangements would shift. Financial responsibilities would be formalized across households. But emotionally, this was the end of something older than the paperwork. The end of me being cast as the steady absorber. He reached for the doorknob behind him, then paused. I am sorry, he said. Not performatively, not loudly. Just plain. I held his gaze. I know. I said, And that was enough. No raised voices. No dramatic declarations. Just acknowledgement. The hallway, once a symbol of secrecy, had become neutral ground. And for the first time, I wasn't standing there as someone's daughter. I was standing there as myself. It's been a year since the doors stopped existing in opposition. We don't live across from each other anymore. My mother moved into a smaller apartment with wide windows and too many plants. She says the light feels different there, less heavy. I visit every Sunday. We drink coffee without listening for footsteps in the hallway. My father moved 3 neighborhoods away, close enough to be present in Lila's life, far enough that proximity no longer creates distortion. The building we once shared still stands, unchanged from the outside. If you walked past it, you would never know how many parallel narratives it held inside its walls. For a while, I wondered if I would become harder after all of it. Bitter, distrustful, guarded in a way that calcifies over time. I didn't. What changed wasn't my softness. It was my boundaries. I no longer translate discomfort into silence automatically. I no longer absorb tension to maintain someone else's image. If something doesn't align, I ask, calmly, directly, early. At work, I've been promoted. Not because of what happened, but because I stopped shrinking in meetings. I speak with the same measured tone I always had, but now I don't preface it with apologies. I still carry my black leather notebook, but it's not for tracking betrayal anymore. It's for clarity. My relationship with my father is structured. We speak. We have dinner occasionally. There's no shouting history between us, no dramatic estrangement. But there is awareness. He no longer delivers speeches about loyalty, and I no longer nod on cue. Lila knows who I am now. She asked once, bluntly, "Are you my sister?" I paused before answering. "Yes," I said, "in a way." Children don't need narrative control. They just need consistency. Eleanor and I exist in a strange, quiet understanding. Not friends, not enemies. 2 women who navigated the same architecture from different rooms. Sometimes people expect me to describe this story as empowering. It wasn't empowering in the cinematic sense. It was clarifying. I learned that quiet isn't the absence of power, it's the refinement of it, that you can dismantle something without humiliating anyone. That protection doesn't require a spectacle. Most importantly, I learned that being the steady one doesn't mean holding everything together. Sometimes it means letting what's unstable fall, with documentation, with preparation, with calm. I am still composed, still observant, still patient, but I am no longer invisible. And I no longer confuse silence with loyalty. If you've listened this far, you might be waiting for a sharper ending. A moment where everything collapses spectacularly, where someone loses everything, where justice looks dramatic and undeniable. But real justice is rarely loud. Sometimes it's paperwork signed without shaking hands. Sometimes it's a woman choosing light-filled windows over familiar walls. Sometimes it's a daughter deciding she will never again be used to stabilize a lie. My father didn't lose his career. He didn't become a public scandal. He didn't stand in the street begging for forgiveness. What he lost was narrative control. What my mother regained was autonomy. What I gained was clarity. There's a difference between reacting to betrayal and responding to it. Reaction is immediate and emotional. Response is intentional and structural. Reaction feels powerful in the moment. Response reshapes the future. For a long time, I thought being calm meant tolerating more than I should. Now I understand something else. Calm can be a strategy. You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to destroy someone to protect yourself. And you don't have to accept a role just because it was handed to you early in life. The most irreversible decisions are often the quietest ones. So if there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. When the foundation cracks, you don't have to set the house on fire. You can simply step back, assess the structure, and decide which parts deserve to remain standing. And maybe the better question isn't, how do I expose them? Maybe it's, how do I protect myself without losing who I am? I'm curious. If you discovered someone you trusted was living a parallel life just steps away from yours, Would you confront them immediately, or would you choose to move in silence first?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.